Hey guys! So the Cold War is finally starting to thaw out. So today is about how the US and the USSR are going to start to make some peace agreements, sort of, and then something's going to happen at the end where that kind of falls apart. So this is our second to last lesson of the Cold War. Finally. Okay. So the two things that you should have maybe responded to in your learning reflection from last class that may have prompted this reconciliation between the US and USSR are the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War. So after the Cuban Missile Crisis and the height of Vietnam, the US and USSR realized that the Cold War may never be won without great expense. So this peace can only come through compromise as opposed to just outright defeating each other. Remember, the end game of the Cold War was to totally defeat the other superpower. However, during this 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, the US and USSR both realized, maybe the other one is pretty powerful. So a series of leaders from both sides begin to cooperate throughout these 3 decades via various treaties and a policy known as détente. So this policy détente refers to the easing of strained political relations. Now, we as Americans use the French words. The Russians have a different word that means basically the same thing, but you need to know détente because we speak English. Okay. So, the US presidents from 1960 to 1988 that are responsible for really leading us through this process of détente starts in 1960 to 1963 with JFK. Remember, JFK cooperated with the USSR during the space race just a little bit. He started opening up those conversations with the USSR, but then people in the USSR didn't like that so much, so that was still kind of an area of mistrust. But he really was the first president to start to open up to that. Then, of course, in 1963, JFK is assassinated and LBJ takes over. And he's really the president known for Vietnam. Then, because Vietnam was so unpopular, Johnson does not get reelected in 1968, and instead Richard Nixon gets elected. He is the one primarily responsible for Vietnamization, ending the Vietnam War, and really starting this process of détente. Then he resigns after a little thing called Watergate. And in 1974, Gerald Ford, his vice president, finishes out his term until 1976. Then Gerald Ford was also not popular because he was associated with Nixon. So Jimmy Carter is elected from 1976 to 1980. And then after Jimmy Carter, who did not do very much, Ronald Reagan, a former Hollywood movie star, is elected from 1980 to 1988. And he is our last Cold War president that we're really going to consider a Cold War president. George H.W. Bush, so George W. Bush's father, is also a Cold War president, but we'll talk more about him next lesson. Okay, so the USSR. There's 3 important leaders that I want you to know after Stalin. You're going to see some year gaps here, but they're not very important, the leaders who are in charge during that time. From 1955 to 1964, Nikita Khrushchev, we've talked about him before, he was the leader of the USSR while Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson are all president of the United States. Then from 1964 to 1982, Leonid Brezhnev, I know these Russian names are really hard, while he's leader, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan are all presidents. So he's leader for almost 20 years, and so that covers a lot of presidents because there's a lot of turnover in that time period in the American government. Then the next important guy is a man named Mikhail Gorbachev, and that's the guy pictured on the bottom corner there. He is the leader of the USSR while Reagan and George H.W. Bush are president. So there's a very famous quote of Ronald Reagan saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," referring to the Berlin Wall. So that's something to look forward to in our next lesson. And he is premier until 1991 when the Soviet Union collapses and the Cold War ends. Okay, so we lose Vietnam. Sad day. Womp womp. But the U.S. realizes that they need better relations with the USSR and China. That was too close, and the communists are very formidable opponents. We can be beaten. So, rather than being defeated outright, we decide maybe that nuclear compromise or some sort of peace agreement is probably the better option than to go to World War III or a nuclear war. Nuclear war was very real and very scary. The US, the USSR, and Great Britain are the only countries capable at this time of nuclear attack. But China and France are quickly developing nuclear weapons, and before the end of this PowerPoint, they do develop nuclear weapons. So this paranoia that we've talked about increases more as more countries seem likely to be capable of nuclear attack. Therefore, each side could potentially gain nuclear allies, which would throw off the balance of power. So Great Britain and the US are on one side, USSR is on another side. France would go to the American side, and China would go to the Soviet side. But as more countries with more and more people start becoming more important, and if they gain nuclear weapons, then the balance could tip either in favor of the US or USSR, and one might have to attack each other. Okay, so Nixon and Detente. This is where this comes into play. Nixon is really the one that advocates for more peaceful relations with China in particular. He's very well known for this, and the USSR. So he initiates Detente. So in 1971, 3 years into his presidency, China joins the UN, which the US obviously has a very powerful presence on the United Nations, and so they allow China to join the UN. This is one of the reasons why we've been open economically to China and politically to China a little bit. This is where this relationship starts to become a little bit closer. But remember, this is still 20 years before the Cold War ends. In 1972, Nixon visits China, and in 1972, Nixon visits the USSR. He is the first president to visit the USSR since FDR visited in 1944. So Truman never went there, Eisenhower never went there, Kennedy never went there, and Johnson never went there. That's 4 or 5 presidents later. He's the only one to visit the other major superpower. It's crazy. Okay, first checkpoint. What events inspired the need for peace? In other words, what finally pushed the US and USSR to the end of compromise? Translate the policy of Detente in your own words, and what steps does Nixon take to initiate Detente? Okay, treaties of Detente begin. Nukes were expensive, dangerous, and they bred mistrust, so they needed to be kept in check. Our first treaty of Detente was the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which we've talked about before. Now, this was in 1968, so this is before Nixon actually took office. 3 things happened. 1, the nuclear signatories, the people who signed it, who held nuclear weapons, agreed not to transfer either nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons technology to any other state. That means country. So we couldn't give our nuclear weapons or the technology to make nuclear weapons to any other country just to help them out. Second thing, the non-nuclear states agreed that they would not receive, develop, or otherwise acquire nuclear weapons. If they were non-nuclear, they had to stay non-nuclear. The third thing, it did not prevent, however, nuclear signatories from developing further weapons. So we could develop as many as we wanted. We just couldn't give them to anybody else. So that's why it's a non-proliferation treaty. So we could reproduce as many weapons as we wanted, we just couldn't spread them around the globe. We had to keep them to ourselves. So one thing that's important about the NPT was that it was not signed by some very powerful countries, such as France and the People's Republic of China. Both of them had nukes by this point, and India or Pakistan did not sign it either. And they developed nukes in 1974 and 1983, respectively. The second nuclear treaty of Detente is called SALT I. That's a Roman numeral I, Roman numeral 1. And SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. Brezhnev and Nixon met in 1972 to discuss the limits on nuclear weapons, as well as to consider some other issues between the two world superpowers. This is really where Detente starts to get the ball rolling. So Brezhnev and Nixon really kick it off with SALT I. One of the things that comes out of this conference is that they agree not to test ICBMs. Those are those intercontinental ballistic missiles. So no more mushroom clouds randomly in the middle of Nevada or Siberia. Second thing it did is that it froze the number of strategic ballistic missiles at existing levels. So that meant we could not develop any further strategic ballistic missiles. So this kind of closed that loophole that the NPT had. So although relations between America and Russia were improving, they still had a long way to go. The two sides had agreed to limit the amount of missiles they would produce. Neither side, though, had actually agreed to get rid of any of their existing missile stocks. So before this happened, a much greater level of trust had to be built up. So we still had nuclear weapons. We just said we wouldn't build any more, but we're not willing to get rid of them yet. There's another treaty called SALT II. Now, SALT II is a little bit different. It took much longer to develop. It took 7 years. Brezhnev then met with President Carter. So this was even, he started it with Nixon, then continued it with Ford probably a little bit, but finally it was Brezhnev and Carter that signed the SALT II treaty. This set even more specific regulations on the different missiles. And each side was limited to a set number of weapons in general. So this is capping all of that, not just the specific ICBMs. But SALT II was never ratified by Congress. So the president signs something. Treaties all have to be ratified by Congress in order to be valid to the United States. So this treaty was never ratified by Congress due to actions by the USSR. What happens in 1979, after Carter signs it and before Congress gets to it, is the USSR invades Afghanistan. And before I tell you about that, complete checkpoint number 2. Why did the US and USSR want to limit nuclear weapons? 5. Which two leaders were responsible for the NPT? 6. What did SALT I accomplish that the NPT did not? You have to listen carefully for that one because I said the answer. And 7. Why was SALT II never ratified by Congress? That takes us right into our last section, which is that the USSR invades Afghanistan. This is known as the Soviets' Vietnam because the USSR entered Afghanistan to fight the overthrow of the communist government that they supported. The people of Afghanistan were trying to stage a coup d'etat. Remember we talked about that with Korea. So basically there are a lot of parallels between the Vietnam War with the US and the USSR and Afghanistan. The USSR wanted the communist government to stay. The people of Afghanistan did not want the communist government to stay, so they tried to overthrow it. When that happened, the Soviets declared war on Afghanistan and entered. So communism was unpopular with the conservative Afghans. Remember that communism enforces atheism. So these people in Afghanistan were mostly Muslim, and so they saw these Marxist ideals as a threat to their Afghan religion and their conservative customs. So there's this rebellious group, the Mujahideen, which you may have heard this word said on the news before or something like that. They decided to fight this holy war, or a jihad, against the USSR to overthrow the communist government that they felt was going against their religion. So they did this for religious purposes, but lots of people were behind them. They were really the ones who initiated the coup d'etat. And they used guerrilla warfare to oppose Soviet influence. You may already be noticing some parallels here. Like the US and Vietnam, the Soviet forces were not trained in guerrilla warfare, but they were fighting somebody, a small rebellious group, that used guerrilla warfare. So they were not going to be successful, just like the US and Vietnam. Then, 4 years after this war begins, the US, UK, which is Great Britain, United Kingdom, all the same thing, Saudi Arabia, and the People's Republic of China, or PRC, they become supporters for Afghanistan. So something happens between China and the USSR where they start to distrust each other a little too as China develops nuclear weapons. So China becomes kind of this third party in this Cold War system, but they're still communist. So these three major countries, plus Saudi Arabia, throw their support behind the Afghanistan rebellion. The Mujahideen get foreign assistance from the U.S., both militarily and financially. And weapons, aircraft, all of those kinds of things that you need to fight a war are supplied by the U.S. and Great Britain, left over from various other wars and supplied by our military that we've developed. Those are channeled through Pakistan. Remember from your map quiz that those are all right next to each other. And Afghanistan at this time borders the USSR. This ultimately ends in stalemate, so the Soviets are forced to withdraw. So similar to how the US is forced to withdraw from Vietnam, the Soviets are forced to withdraw from Afghanistan. However, there wasn't really any more of a civil war after this. So the year that the Soviets finally withdraw is in 1989, 10 years later. Our final checkpoint. Why did the USSR invade Afghanistan? 9. Who are the Mujahideen and whose support do they have? Number 10. What parallels does the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan have with the U.S. involvement of Vietnam? Name at least 2. I said way more than that. And after you finish this checkpoint, you've completed your homework. Congratulations!